The history of South Africa is thousands of years old, but the current state of South Africa started to develop from one pivotal moment just over 400 years ago. Said moment was the establishment of the Cape Colony by the Dutch East India Company out of the Netherlands in 1652. When the Dutch arrived, they were met by a black indigenous people called the Khoisan. The Khoisan people had inhabited the area of South Africa by Cape Town for approximately 1500 to 2000 years. However, this didn't mean much to the Dutch settlers. In the years ensuing the Dutch landing, there was a new hierarchy that emerged amongst the groups living in the Cape. At the top of the hierarchy were Afrikaners, who were Dutch or of Dutch descent. The reason for the coining of this new name by the Dutch was the fact that after a few generations, the Dutch underwent an identity change. They no longer connected themselves with their homeland, and rather now saw themselves as Africans and named themselves as such. Below them in the hierarchy were the indigenous Khoisan. Khoisan were subordinated more or less from the get-go after Dutch arrival. And then to round it out at the bottom were the enslaved peoples that were imported from outside of South Africa. For the next century and a half, the established hierarchy reigned supreme and became an integral part of South African society. At this time as well, the Dutch attempted to enact many laws that were precursors to those that eventually found their way into practice during segregation and apartheid, especially laws similar to the past laws that you will hear more about later on. So for the time being, very little changed in the landscape of South African history. The next major turning point in South African history comes in 1800 when the British arrive. At the time, the British had a sprawling empire spanning the globe, with their most important colony in the empire being India. To this point, there was no shortcut to get there. The only way was to sail the enormous distance from England around the bottom of Africa and up to India. The Cape Colony's position gave it immense value to the British strategically as a halfway point to India. With this value in mind, the British claimed the Cape Colony as their own, disrupting Afrikaner control. An ethnic animosity between the British and Afrikaners arose out of the bold British claim that lingered for many years. A contentious move that the British made that fueled some of the animosity was their abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and then slavery altogether in 1834. The British didn't stop there, however. They went on to enact Ordinance 50 that granted land to former slaves. It all seemed to be going on the right track for the Africans until the country faced a new turning point that once again turned the tides against the Africans in 1867. In 1867, the mineral revolution in South Africa began with the discovery of diamonds. Then, in 1886, the revolution was reignited with the discovery of gold. By the turn of the century, South Africa was the world's leading producer of both gold and diamonds. American methods and know-how, backed by British capital, had mineral production off and running, but South African labor is what was able to propel the mineral revolution to the scale it achieved. Out of the mineral revolution came an armed struggle between the Afrikaners and the British called the Boer War, or South African War. At the end of the conflict, the British came out on top. In the Treaty of Vereeniging that ended the conflict, there was a common understanding that both ethnic groups needed to be at the top of society and that they needed to keep the Africans relegated to being laborers so the nation's economy could continue to be the powerhouse that it was. To do this, the Natives Land Act of 1913 was enacted, building off of the Glenn Gray Act of 1893. The acts worked in tandem to push the Africans into migrant labor and as much out of the white areas as possible. The most inflammatory act, however, was the Natives Act of 1923 that mandated that Africans carry passes that would allow them to work in white areas. However, they were subjected to curfews and additional taxes if their passes weren't in order. There was strong discontent with these acts, however, it was only a small part of what was to come in 1948. With the shock victory of the National Party in 1948, apartheid officially came into being. Thus began the official anti-apartheid movement. From this point forward, there were two ideologies about what the actions of the movement should be. Those trains of thought being nonviolent and violent. These two ideologies will be discussed further in depth in future episodes, but there are a few things that you should keep in mind from now on. The nonviolent sect of the struggle was led by Chief Albert Lutuli, who was greatly influenced by Gandhi's success with nonviolence in India. He felt Gandhi's methods would be able to overturn the regime. However, as the struggle dragged on, many started to feel that more radical means would finally force the government's hand in changing their oppressive ways.
Go the way. One of the most important organizations in the fight against apartheid was the African National Congress. The ANC was founded on January 8, 1912. Originally named the South African Native National Congress, it was renamed as the African National Congress in 1923. The Congress was founded in response to the Union of South Africa, which occurred on May 31, 1910, between the British and the Afrikaners. The formation came about due to the fact that the Union disenfranchised black South Africans and forced them to live in a government that did not recognize their rights. Reverend John Dube was the first president of the South African Native National Congress when it was founded in 1910. The SANNC also established a newspaper when they were founded, called the Abantu Bato, which would later become the main way that the group would spread information. In the beginning, the ANC was known for adopting Gandhi-like styles of nonviolent direct action campaigns. These included protests and petitions, but never sanctioned acts of violence. One such form of protest was a petition from the Reverend Dube on February 14, 1914, which advocated against the Native Land Act and was sent directly to the Prime Minister, Louis Botha. This petition, as well as many others and many other nonviolent protests, had little to no impact on apartheid. As both SANNC sanctioned and other nonviolent protests continued, they often resulted in some death to those protesting. For example, a 1913 strike at a diamond mine resulted in 11 mine workers being killed and 37 being injured. In 1919, 700 protesters in just Johannesburg were arrested following an anti-pass campaign by the SANNC. Over time, the SANNC, and later the ANC, became the leading anti-apartheid force in the country. They would frequently protest the Native Land Act, pass laws, and other apartheid laws. A major figure in the ANC's fight against apartheid was Chief Albert John Luthuli. Luthuli was a former teacher, and in 1935, he was persuaded to become a chief of his hometown of Grattville. He took this position despite the fact that it came with a salary only 20% of his original teaching salary. Luthuli became chief not to better himself by becoming a puppet for the government as many others had done at the time, but because he wanted to help his people. Luthuli did not take bribes in his chiefdom and was considered to be a fair chief of the people. In 1944, he joined the ANC following the death of John Dube, and in 1952, Luthuli was a major figure in the Defiance Campaign, an effort to resist apartheid on behalf of the ANC and several other multiracial organizations. While the campaign did not and was not expected to end apartheid, around 9,000 people went to prison for defying the laws, and the campaign was considered a win for the ANC. As a result of the campaign, Luthuli was elected ANC president in 1952, and subsequently was removed from his duties as chief by the South African government. On June 26, 1955, the ANC made a public declaration to the South African government and the people of South Africa in the form of the Freedom Charter. The first line of the charter begins, "We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people." This angered some members of the ANC who consider themselves Africanists. They were unhappy with the ANC becoming a multiracial organization, and as such, they left the ANC, and on April 6, 1959, the Pan-Africanist Congress was formed as a rival anti-apartheid organization. The Freedom Charter scared members of the apartheid government and caused them to fear that the ANC, with the help of the Communist Party, was trying to overthrow the government. In 1956, the apartheid government indicted 156 leaders of the Congress of the People for treason. Before the prosecution completed their case, 73 of the 156 people had their charges withdrawn, including Albert Luthuli and Oliver Tambo. As the case went on, it became clear that the state did not have the case that they thought they did against these individuals. And in 1961, no one was found guilty of treason. The government's attempt to end the ANC and the Freedom Charter was a long and complete failure. At the end of 1959, Luthuli announced that 1960 would be the year of the pass. This entailed a series of protests across the nation specifically aimed at abolishing the pass laws. The PAC followed the lead and also planned their own series of anti-pass protests for 1960, beginning in March, which ultimately resulted in one of the most tragic and cataclysmic events in the anti-apartheid struggle, the Sharpeville Massacre. On March 21, 1960, protesters in Sharpeville were met with violence outside of the police station. At around 1:15 in the afternoon, police opened fire for 2 minutes, killing 69 people and seriously wounding 180. While this was not an ANC protest, the ramifications for the ANC were swift and harsh, with both the ANC and the PAC being nationally banned on April 8, 1960. After they were banned, the ANC was forced underground. The underground effort was led by Oliver Tambo, who immediately fled the country and worked on gaining support for the ANC abroad. Luthuli was arrested for pass burning soon after, which allowed Nelson Mandela to gain support in the ANC. Mandela lobbied for the ANC to make the move to a violent resistance, something which Luthuli opposed. Luthuli never publicly gave his blessing for the armed struggle, but eventually the rest of the ANC acquiesced to Mandela, and the Spear of the Nation, or MK, was formed on December 16, 1961. The ANC had limited political abilities following Sharpeville, being as they were an underground organization. Oliver Tambo worked in other countries to try to bring about international support for the anti-apartheid struggle. Although the ANC could never quite get back the support they had when they were a legal organization, too many people had too much to lose to be involved with the ANC and risk going to prison. Tambo became the next president and continued his work internationally to varying success. As the student rebellion in 1976 and the Black consciousness movement became more prevalent, Tambo struggled to keep the ANC relevant in the struggle. In 1990, the ANC became unbanned, and Nelson Mandela was elected president after being imprisoned for 27 years on Robben Island, following Tambo's stroke and subsequent loss of speech in 1989. As apartheid began to finally end, the ANC under Mandela played a large role in the transition to the post-apartheid government. The president of South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, frequently spoke to Mandela to figure out how to make this transition effective. In 1994, South Africa held its first universal elections, and the ANC won by an overwhelming majority, making Nelson Mandela the first black president of the Republic of South Africa. The ANC had a long road in the struggle to end apartheid, but ultimately they saw success after decades and decades of setbacks, failure, and persecution.
Up until 1960, the ANC and PAC had unwaveringly committed to nonviolent protest movements. This all changed when on March 21, 1960, the South African Defense Force opened fire on a peaceful protest, killing 69 civilians and injuring 180 more. This would become known as the Sharpeville Massacre. Images of this unwarranted violence shocked the nation and the international community. Shortly afterwards, the South African government banned the ANC and PAC. With the government's escalated violence, the nature of the ANC's nonviolent struggle was questioned. One of the key supporters for an armed struggle was Nelson Mandela. Mandela argued that peaceful protests were not working. The only way that they would be able to get their freedom is by arming black South Africans and overthrowing the regime. Blacks needed the ability to be able to defend themselves against such monstrous violence as was seen in Sharpeville. However, there was much tension on whether a term to armed struggle was the correct answer for the ANC. The ANC's current president at the time, Albert Luthuli, argued that the ANC had been built around the idea of nonviolent protest, and that by changing that, the ANC would no longer represent the ideals that it was founded on. Eventually, enough support for Mandela's armed struggle was gained, and on December 16, 1961, Umkhonto we Sizwe was created. Mandela's plan for MK was to have them create acts of sabotage, since sabotage wouldn't endanger lives. Mandela thought that it would offer the best hope for reconciliation among the races afterwards. However, if sabotage didn't work, Mandela said MK was prepared to move on to the next stage, guerrilla warfare and terrorism. MK conducted these acts of sabotage on things that represented the racist authoritarian government, such as pass offices. Sabotage of these buildings was done through bombings. Due to lack of the resources and knowledge, the bombs that MK created were crude improvised explosives. Former MK recruit Ronnie Krazels remembers how some of these IEDs were created using condoms and gelatin capsules as devices. Destroying these targets had little effect on the government, however they set the news and white population of South Africa ablaze with fear. To start the organization, Mandela took trips in 1962 to Nigeria, Algeria, Tunisia, and Ethiopia in order to gain military training and support for MK's new recruits. Shortly after this, Mandela sent more than 300 recruits to be trained abroad. However, MK faced a huge setback when on July 11, 1963, Special Forces raided a Williesley farmhouse where MK leadership was planning Operation Mayabeyu. High-ranking officials were arrested, and days later, Nelson Mandela was associated with the organization and arrested. The trial of those arrested was seen around the world and called the Rivonia Trials. After Mandela's arrest, Oliver Reginald Tambo took control of the ANC. While Tambo was the leader of the ANC, at the Third Consultative Congress, the Revolutionary Program was created. This program described the current situation of South Africa and why the ANC had turned armed struggle. This went against the Freedom Charter in 1955 that determined the ANC to be a nonviolent organization. After the Soweto uprising, thousands of young South Africans fled to neighboring countries to join the armed struggle. This reinvigorated MK. Over 1977 to 1980, MK conducted 82 successful sabotage operations. Also, between 1980 and 1982, MK was able to conduct some high-profile attacks. In 1980, MK attacked the Saulberg coal-to-oil refinery using mine and rock attacks. Then in 1982, MK attacked the Kroger nuclear power station. MK attacks would continue throughout the next decade. These attacks, such as the Church Street bombing, continued to create tension and argument within the ANC about whether armed struggle was the correct approach. However, Umkhonto we Sizwe would exist and continue operating all the way until 1990.
The Pan-Africanist Congress, sometimes referred to as the PAC, is a South African political party founded in 1959 by Africanists who broke away from the African National Congress. This was in response to the Freedom Charter, which was adopted as the core set of principles by the African National Congress, who became more partial to other interest groups like the South African Indian Conference, the Colored People's Conference, and the South African Congress of Democrats. The Africanists believed that Africans should be more celebrated in a post-apartheid South Africa than these other groups, and that their presence only diluted their cause. In emphasizing African nationalism and continental unity, they represented an alternative party from the ANC that was more Afrocentric and focused on the struggle beyond just South Africa. They also hoped to build on momentum from nations like Ghana, for example, who had achieved their independence from British rule in 1957. One of their earliest actions as a group was a peaceful demonstration against pass laws on March 21, 1960, that later became known as the Sharpeville Massacre, where at least 69 unarmed civilians were slain and 180 more were injured by South African police, who opened fire on the crowd. Instead of attempting to save face and minimize humanitarian damages from the shooting, the South African government doubled down, supporting the police and claiming that Sharpeville was necessary. The heightened media presence at this tragedy brought the anti-apartheid movement to the international stage, which was essential after the swift banning of the PAC and ANC just 3 days after Sharpeville. The PAC became more well-known after this, but because of their public banning by the government, saw many members arrested, including their first president, Robert Sobukwe. Sobukwe was kept in solitary confinement for 19 years, notably longer than his original sentence, and was considered so dangerous to the ruling National Party that they made a law, the Sobukwe Clause, that allowed his imprisonment to be reviewed annually at the discretion of the Minister of Justice. Shortly after Sharpeville, the PAC founded the Azanian People's Liberation Army, known as POCO, which served as the armed wing of the Congress. POCO to the PAC was equivalent to what MK was to the ANC, but POCO operated differently than MK. POCO operated underground and was focused on the assassination of policemen, alleged informers, and notably African chiefs who were seen by POCO as collaborators and participants in the oppressive apartheid system. Into the 80s, the PAC struggled to maintain an underground political system that was on the same level as its POCO underground operation, and eventually suffered from weak leadership, internal conflict, and diminishing funds. By the 90s, they had a small following and had lost many supporters to the ANC, who had successfully negotiated the end of apartheid. The PAC never garnered the same amount of support that it had in the early 60s, and proceeded to make poor decisions that led to its falling out of favor. In their day, they provided an outlet for Africans who disagreed with the ANC's agenda, were organizers of one of the most important moments in the anti-apartheid struggle, and established one of the most effective underground arm wings in the country between Sharpeville and the end of apartheid.
The anti-apartheid movement was not only domestic but international. While starting in the 1960s during the Cold War, the global response to the oppressive system can trace its roots to the petty apartheid years. As Daniel Milan and the National Party took power in 1948, the Western world had shifted its focus towards the Soviet Union. The rise of communism and the fear of a domino effect caused the global powers to align against the Cold War. U.S. President Harry Truman wanted to limit such influence and chose to overlook the brutal South African government in favor of its anti-communist policies. The National Party and the U.S. effectively became allies due to its shared belief in private enterprise and the fear of a Soviet takeover. The government in South Africa thus had free rein over the discriminatory and oppressive system as the rest of the world turned a blind eye. This secret agreement was intact so long as they fought against communism and limited the sphere of Soviet influence. The Sharpeville massacre can be seen as a turning point for the international community's response to apartheid. In March 1960, police officers opened fire on protesters outside of a police station. 69 people were murdered and over 186 were wounded. However, these estimates may not be accurate and many believe more were affected. After the event, the government praised police officers and continued to subdue blacks along with the ANC. Such violence would not be overlooked by global politics. The United Nations, along with citizens around the world, called for justice against the South African government. The UN Security Council, in Resolution 134, asked the National Party to, quote, initiate measures aimed at bringing racial harmony based on equality and abandon its policies of apartheid and racial discrimination. Sharpeville established that apartheid was a global issue, not an internal affair for South Africa. Economic sanctions and withdrawal of support were devised in the later years to collapse the government and put an end to the system that ruined the lives of an entire generation. Sanctions were believed to be an effective way to pressure the National Party. The UN General Assembly in 1962 first asked that member states end all trade, diplomatic relations, and transportation with South Africa, as long as apartheid continued to exist. However, main trading partners within the Security Council continued to veto such legislation that passed within the General Assembly. An arms embargo would be called for in 1963 and would only be passed until 1977 after 3 failed attempts. To aid victims, the General Assembly in 1963 also called for members to donate funds to assist those affected. The Special Committee Against Apartheid was also created to aid and support the fight against the system. The UN's response to apartheid can be seen as a failure and a success. While the General Assembly successfully passed resolutions to condemn and put sanctions on the South African government, the Security Council limited the scope of pressure. Internal ties with the South African government and its stance against communism pressured the United States and the United Kingdom, along with other Western powers, to veto resolutions from becoming legislation. The Cold War thus had a major impact on the role of apartheid's international support. While governments around the world settled on their support or opposition to apartheid, citizens within these countries voiced their opinions as well. In June 1959, South African exiles, along with British supporters, called for a boycott of South African goods. These included fruits, cigarettes, and all sorts of items that came from South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement, or AAM as abbreviated, believed that buying goods from South Africa was equivalent to supporting apartheid. So long as the country continued sales around the world, the National Party, along with the South African government, would continue to fund their oppressive and discriminatory practices. At the time of the Sharpeville massacre, the UK was South Africa's largest investor, and South Africa was the UK's third largest exporter. The movement was originally assembled from Chief Abra Lutuli's advocacy for an international boycott. Britain's Labour and Liberal parties supported the organization, as did many others. The role of this event sparked international support and expanded across the globe to citizens around the world. Awareness of the harsh cruelties were presented by Oliver Tambo, leader of the ANC in exile for over 30 years. As the rest of its members were in jail, Tambo was the voice of a political party and the victims of apartheid. He addressed the media outlets and traveled across the world to ask for countries' support. His campaigns became critical to the international movement. Protests and support would continue through the 1970s with the Soweto uprisings and the rise of MK. In the late 1970s, the anti-apartheid movement in the U.S. kicked into gear on college campuses. Students and faculty protested against their universities to divest their holdings that did business with South Africa. The grassroots movement corresponded with the nature of youth disobedience during the Soweto uprisings in 1976. By 1988, over 150 colleges and universities would divest from South Africa, partially or in full. The University of California system divested over $3 billion. Support from the U.S. also came from legislative bodies and groups. Funds were raised to support political prisoners, and boycotts were made against South African culture, including sporting events. African American leaders in the Congressional Black Caucus raised their voices against Congress in opposition to apartheid, which helped pressure the passing of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. The law would impose economic sanctions on the government of South Africa until Nelson Mandela and political prisoners were released, as well as the entering of good faith negotiations with the black community. President Ronald Reagan at the time vetoed the law, but was overturned by Congress. He believed that economic sanctions would collapse the government but would create a worse economic state for the victims. Grassroots campaigning would continue after the passage, with education and awareness spread by people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Around the world, people continued to resist until apartheid ended. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, igniting the end to an oppressive system. Apartheid would be repealed fully in April 1994.
Amandla! Amandla! Oliver Tambo! Oliver Tambo! Teta Robota! Oliver Tambo! Oliver Tambo! Teta Robota! Mandela Sobota! Mandela Sobota! Mandela Sobota!
With the beginning of the 80s, anti-apartheid movements and enthusiasms were reborn. The ANC had gained an international foothold, and former Prime Minister Verster had been replaced by the notorious P.W. Botha. Early on, nobody knew what to expect with the new administration. Botha was highly concerned with the future of apartheid, and knew that his predecessor had neglected the problem. Botha had said that Forster had plenty of money and resources to fix the nation, but failed to do so. Soon after entering office, Botha started to pass various reforms that he believed would provide the answers to the apartheid problem. His reasoning behind this change in heart was explained at a nationalist rally during 1979, was that the tides of influence were changing, and it was adapt or die. He abolished parts of the Mixed Marriage Act and the Immorality Act in 1979, but his most controversial reform was the creation of the tricameral parliament. This parliament was divided into 3 chambers, and finally allowed coloreds and Indians to have representation in Congress. However, Africans were not represented in this new parliament, and waves of protest plagued the nation. It was truly a democratic movement that represented very ordinary men and women, and that was the strength of the UDF. This quote from South African government official Le de Villiers shows the impact of this new resistance.
The ANC had been built up internationally ever since it was banned in the 60s. Now it had a solid domestic presence again and was able to organize. Despite this, the ANC alone was not enough to topple apartheid, as this would require a unified force. The 80s apartheid resistance is defined by the United Democratic Front, or UDF. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1983, the UDF was officially created. Alan Bosek, in a rousing speech, stated that this was the broadest, most significant coalition of organizations struggling against apartheid racism and injustice since the 50s.
We are here to say that the government's constitutional proposals are inadequate and that they do not express the will of the vast majority of South Africa's people. But more than that, we are here to say that what we are working for is one undivided South Africa which shall belong to all of its people. An open democracy from which no single South African shall be excluded, a society in which the human dignity of all its people shall be respected. We are here to say that there are rights that are neither conferred by nor derived from the state. To discover their origin, you have to move back beyond the dim mist of eternity. They are God-given. And so we are here not to beg for those rights, we are here to claim them.
This public launch was attended by over 1,500 delegates and observers from recently formed UDF allies, which included over 500 organizations from across the country. The UDF had humble beginnings and was started in order to directly combat the intense National Party reforms. It wasn't just one organization, but more like a banner for the other organizations to rally behind. Ultimately, the UDF would fill the void that Black consciousness couldn't. Originally, Steve Biko of the Black consciousness movement wanted to unify all Africans under one movement. He wanted a huge coalition of a combined PAC, ANC, and BC, but he was assassinated in 1977. With his death, Black consciousness suffered, but the ideology remained. In 1979, the ANC decided to accept all forms of anti-apartheid resistance and moved to create a united front. The front would be independent of the Freedom Charter. Each group must believe in democracy, adhere to the needs of anti-apartheid struggle, believe in the creation of a non-racial South Africa, and recognize the importance of working in a coalition for the betterment of oppressed people wherever they may be. Soon after its creation, disaster struck. On September 3, 1985, protesters in Vaal Triangle were holding a demonstration against Heinrich. Police showed up, and 30 people died in the clashes between police and protesters. Immediately, the government put the region under a state of emergency. Botha, once bent on reform, decided against change and started to rely on force. Botha then put the entire country under a state of emergency in the months that followed. The South African government's response to the anti-apartheid groups changed radically with the state of emergency. No longer was it single raids targeted at leaders, but now occupations of townships, with the South African Defence Force using armored vehicles against the local populations. In response to this, MK also began to loosen its restrictions on violent resistance, moving away from the targeting of infrastructure with minimal casualties, civilian or government, to very public attacks, culminating in bombings of a cafe and a mall.
When the state of emergency ended, the government was in panic. In 1988, the UDF was banned. However, because the UDF was made of many organizations, the ban was more so political. With heavier restrictions, the UDF planned a giant campaign of resistance. This campaign became known as the Defiance Campaign, and was a time of mass protest and civil disobedience in 1989. It was to be a mass campaign of nonviolence, targeting apartheid laws and rejecting the reforms that didn't help the people. The first stage was against racial segregation of hospitals, and saw a mass amount of people gathering around hospitals throughout South Africa. Afterwards, individual protests took place, but eventually the movement shifted to beach protests. On August 19th, thousands of Africans went to whites-only beaches and were met with heavy police resistance. Those who didn't leave were arrested or chased off by the police. The reaction of the so-called reformist government to this protest received a negative attention from citizens and those abroad. As the 80s came to a close, so did the UDF. In 1990, the ANC was unbanned and finally able to work in South Africa in the open. With the major party back in the country, the UDF dissolved and threw its support to the ANC. The work of the ANC and the mass protests created by the UDF severely crippled the government of South Africa and allowed the peace talks for the end of apartheid to take place. The UDF was a critical part of the end of apartheid and showed just how powerful a united force could be.